Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's MarkMonitor webinar, Connecting the Dots with Investigative Reports. I'm Corinne Hutchinson, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. During today's event, all participant lines will be muted. This is to ensure that there isn't any background noise or interference. Following today's presentation, we'll be holding a Q&A session. To submit a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A tab located on your WebEx console. We are recording today's webinar, and we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the recording and presentation slides. So please be on the lookout for those materials. With that, I'd like to introduce Brittany Shaw and Nancy Merritt, our speakers for today's session. Brittany Shaw is a brand protection consultant with MarkMonitor and has 5 years of experience spanning activities throughout the IP lifecycle, from registration, licensing, and protection. She has partnered with global corporations in the pharmaceutical, collegiate, and fashion and luxury space to help create comprehensive brand protection strategies. Her current emphasis is leveraging big data through new technologies to connect the dots to the physical world through tactics like rogue website litigation and providing qualified leads to law enforcement entities. Nancy Merritt is a global relationship manager for MarkMonitor, responsible for establishing and cultivating relationships across all of MarkMonitor's brand partners, including but not limited to online marketplaces and social media, various legal firms, law enforcement, and investigative firms. She has several years of experience in online brand protection, helping prestigious global brands make a significant impact in their programs. Her current primary focus is to create collaborative and mutually beneficial relationships between brand owners and partners in the fight against online infringement. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Brittany to get us started.
All right, hello everyone. This is Brittany Shaw. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the agenda for today's presentation. Nancy and I are going to take you through kind of the big data and actionable intelligence cycle that we use here at MarkMonitor. We want to really just explain, have you walk away with a basic understanding of MarkMonitor's investigative services, and we want to share some real-life case studies of how we've used these things. And we're all going to be sure to leave time for discussion and Q&A. So I won't bore you with reading through all of the bullets here. All right, let's jump right in. So when deciding to actually start with collecting data, it's important to remove the filters and cast a wide net. Too often we start with a tip online, or we may have an affiliate problem or distributor problem, and we focus solely on that. But it's important to really expand your horizons and collect all the data points, whether or not in the beginning you think they're valuable, they could be later on. So a few of the data points that we specifically look at is shipping data. We leverage a law enforcement database. We use our online tools and a variety of Thomson Reuters technologies. So we give you the breadth and the depth of the technology and the data of where to start. So this is our actionable intelligence cycle. We typically start with the monitoring and enforcing online, and this is through a traditional brand protection program. And this is essentially the approach we take with starting a targeted investigation. So then we just talked about collecting data and analyze data. Again, we cast a wide net, and we investigate and report to equip you with law enforcement and attorneys and leverage our key relationships. So really, if we look at number 2, the data we're collecting and analyzing after we cast that wide net is really the infringing data. This infringing data could be sellers on marketplaces that have a high volume targeting your brand, maybe a seller we've enforced on several times that we're having a hard time getting down, or just somebody you've identified as a high value target. Step 3, when we leverage those multiple technology sources, and then 4 and 5 can be synonymous with each other. Oftentimes we want to leverage our key relationships to get us to the law enforcement, civil litigation, criminal litigation stage. Other times it's more equipping them first and then figuring out who else we can go to if we run into a barrier. So the backbone of our process is really our technology. And what this anti-counterfeiting technology is it's an automated process using several unique multi-factor algorithms to connect automatically classify sites and then connect them and relate them to each other in a meaningful way. So we start with a deep detection. So really there are 3 levels of the internet. There's the visible internet that you see on Google, Yahoo, Bing, etc. that consumers typically use. There's the deep web, with sites that are not indexed by Google or any of these search engines. And then there's the dark net. So MarkMonitor captures the visible and the deep web layers of the internet to automatically detect e-commerce sites that are infringing upon your brand. After we do that, we do this classification process automatically. So we can compare sites that maybe they look and feel like a counterfeit site. The page code is off. Maybe there's broken English on the site that is tipping us off, or deep discounting. There's really thousands of attributes that we look at to positively say that a site is confirmed rogue. So there is a caveat to our technology. Right now, we're using this technology for all physical goods, but we use a similar and different technology for our phishing reports. So those are a little bit separate. But for the most part, this is the backbone of our investigative process. So after the deep detection, the automated classification, we then start a process called clustering. And this is our network intelligence technology. So what the clustering does is it looks at all of these sites that we've confirmed as counterfeit, and it says it makes meaningful connections between them. So site A and site C, maybe they share the same who is record. Maybe site C shares the page code with site D, etc. So we can make those connections to put them into networks. So to a very high degree, we can say that a network of 100 sites is positively related within a 99% accuracy. So by clustering and networking automatically, we have a really good starting point for this investigative report. We know that these sites are related. We can now start looking at their presence across the web, and then we can start pulling in the outside technologies like shipping data and the physical world information to put something meaningful together to actually find the person behind your infringement. So I've shown an example here up on the screen. And then what we'll do is we'll kind of go back to the investigative process. So now that we have a good understanding of the technology behind it, we're going to go into a little more detail here. So we have the rogue site networking. We pull in, like I said, shipping data, law enforcement database, which leads us to business registrations, online profiles, you name it. We really do that wide data collection first. And then what happens is we have a team of experts that do the analysis piece. So this team of experts has gone through several investigative trainings with multiple firms, high background checks to be able to access some of this sensitive data. So we don't just give everyone at MarkMonitor free access to go ahead and search these profiles. They really have to go through hours and hours of extensive training. And then this analysis, we actually put together data-driven recommendations. And as we're compiling this investigative report, we also pull in different things like maybe test purchases for evidentiary support. We can also, from those test purchases, pull off maybe an address or a certain key data point that we would not have gotten otherwise that would feed into the investigative process. And then we also collect from, maybe shipping seizure notices. Those are also very valuable pieces of information that we can get to also put into these things. And then we really compile a full investigative report that we can just take directly to law enforcement, So the investigative piece, some companies, we know this presentation maybe not for everybody. Maybe a lot of your, brands maybe don't want to do criminal investigation or litigation. That's fine. But we do provide a full package to send right over to them for raids, arrest, prosecution, whatever your use case is. We'll try to, tailor that to you. So one of the big key points we want to make on this slide is the investigative piece. So many of you have probably worked with law enforcement in some capacity, the IPR center, whoever it may be. And it used to be you could simply submit a list of sites you felt were related to the IPR center for seizure. Unfortunately, those days are over. Law enforcement really requires a full investigation, and to prioritize your problem, they really need all of the pieces laid out and in place. So it's become a bit of a challenge for brand owners because there's a lot of things in the way of doing that. You may not know where to start. There's a lot of different things that could come up, a lot of snags. maybe there's not just the resources internally. So this process is made to just be able to hand over and prioritize those things and hopefully expedite the investigative process with law enforcement. Nancy, did you want to add anything to the investigative piece?
No, I think that's great. We definitely progressed from a time of being able to just hand over a list of here's 1,000 counterfeit sites. And, Brittany and I have worked closely with some of our local and federal law enforcement and asked them to review this process for us and let us know if, we hand this to a brand owner or we create this target, what is it that you need to make a case for it? So we feel like we've done a pretty good process of identifying all those different pieces and parts of what's going to help you be able to take this to your law enforcement representatives and actually have them open a case.
Yeah. And we've been very fortunate to have these reports vetted ahead of time to make sure we're not missing any of those pieces to get that process started. All right, so we want to give you some real-life case studies and examples. The slides we have before us are pretty generic, but I want to talk through one flavor of our investigative reports. This particular example is a website investigative report. So we call those reports just based on the type of tip we start with to really lead to a full investigation. So the one you see before you was done for a pharmaceutical company at one point, and the only tip we had was we had 2 sites that look and feel the same. The problem facing a lot of pharmaceutical companies are these templated sites. There's a kit of templated sites, people throw them up, put the brand drugs on there, and simply just send them out. So we found out that these sites particularly had the exact same look and feel. The company name was slightly blurred out and it was changed, and there was also different phone numbers. But the text on the page was the exact same. They were selling the same brands for the same price, exactly the same, only the contact information was different. They were hiding behind a proxy registration service, which kind of made it a little bit more difficult. However, we saw that the signature of the page, the same graphics, URL naming conventions, fonts, and layout, was 99% similar between these sites. A deeper investigation of the sites showed that there were several behind this. There was a network of 63 sites specifically that all had the same template. So it was a good starting point to say, oh, we have a suspicious behavior going on. Let's see what's going on behind these sites and if we can find the person or the people behind it that are infringing. So what our team of analysts did is they went out and they actually set up a fake company, and they contacted the site owner directly, and they said, hey, we're a wholesaler. We want to figure out what's going on. We want your price sheet. Fortunately for us, one of the sites sent back a faxed copy of their price sheet. On that price sheet, we had other tips, such as a physical address, a business owner name, and some other basic information about those companies that was not on the website. So that really gave us a really good starting point to spider out and do this investigation. From that business name, we were able to pull out the business registration. We had actual names behind it and actual people behind it. So it's just a good example of one small tip. No tip is small enough for us to investigate. Beyond this investigation, we also found a social media profile. We found a physical address, 2 physical addresses that seemed to be that they were working together. From the business registration, we found the person's name, and we were able to find out where he lived, his home address, a picture of his house, the companies that he operated. It found that this one gentleman was associated with all of the websites and owned the registrations for all of the business names that we got back from this one fax. So it's been, the point I'm trying to make here is really, if you have any sites of concern, that's a small enough but big enough tip for us to investigate. Through these other tactics and just being creative and having the time and the resources to do so, we can really show not only here are just 2 websites, we can send to C&D, maybe we can't get it down, contact the ISP, can't get it down, but showing the actual physical location will give us a hard target to go after. That's enough for law enforcement to say, I'm going to go visit this house. We could explore further assets that these people may have, which Nancy will explain in another case study, and really launch a full investigation. So that's just one example, and I'll turn it over to Nancy for the next case study.
Thanks, Brittany. Hey, everybody, this is Nancy. So I'm going to jump in on this next case study and talk you through it a little bit. So as Brittany said, we start with maybe one little piece of data, and it might be a piece of data that we look at, you know, every day. So she started with a websites tip. I'm going to talk through one that came actually from one of our very well-known and common online B2B marketplace sites, right? So a lot of brand owners, as well as, you know, the folks on our end, are constantly looking through all of those different marketplace listings for various infringements, and we're, you know, doing a lot of the what everybody now knows and refers to as kind of the whack-a-mole method. And I think there's still some legitimacy in that because you have to maintain some level of just keeping the noise down. But when we start looking at maybe some of who, you know, those higher volume sellers are on those marketplaces, particularly on the B2B side, we can look and see if there's something further that we can dive into that might provide us with an on-the-ground target and some seizable assets. So in this particular case, we started with a known counterfeit seller. So this was somebody that a brand had done purchases and enforced on multiple times in the past, and they repeatedly, you know, just kept popping back up on this marketplace. So instead, we decided to, you know, to look at a different angle, and we got some access to customs shipping information, sea containers. So we started looking at, okay, where is this particular seller on, you know, this marketplace side shipping stuff to? Like, who's buying the stuff on the other end, right? So we found a particular buyer who seemed to be making repeated large purchases from this known counterfeit seller. Now, at this point, we don't know for sure, right, what they're purchasing. We don't know what's in the containers. But we have enough data to kind of figure out, you know, there might be something worth pursuing here. So we take a look and we find that this buyer is purchasing, you know, large amounts of quantity from this known counterfeit seller, and the buyer actually has a U.S. location. So they're importing now, you know, potentially counterfeit goods into the U.S. market. We take that information and we start diving into some of those other records and things that we have access to. So now we've been able to determine where their location is in the U.S., who the different employees, which ended up, I think, being mostly family members in this particular case. They had a main business entity located in Brooklyn. And then we could also take a look at, you know, that they were further then distributing the stuff they were getting in out to other entities within the U.S. So now we have, you know, a location on the ground, some potentially seizable assets, and something that we can take, you know, either to a civil or criminal investigator to pursue further if, you know, you wanted to go to the on-the-ground location. All right. So then beyond that, let's take a look at kind of what that network looks like. So, you know, you take the one piece of information, you find the target on the ground, great. But what we want to know, too, is where does that target filter out? So I think Brittany mentioned earlier kind of that spidering effect, right? So as part of this process and this report, you'll get this network, which shows all these different entities and pieces, the individual events, the individual behaviors, and, you know, how they're all connected. So you've got the primary target, you know, here are their affiliates, their associates, their different aliases, email addresses, website registrations, all the things that are associated with that particular target. So now that target becomes much more valuable, right, because you have all these things that are linked to it. And, you know, the value in that is that you're now not just doing that whack-a-mole, kind of hitting those individual pieces and parts. You're now trying to dismantle that entire network. So I know the information's blurred out and you can't really see what all those little dots and pieces mean, but you can kind of get an idea of what a fully investigated network can look like once we looked at all the possible connections and how they're related and how they connect back to that source, right? So it's like cutting off the head of the snake. I mean, you want to get to, if you don't have that person who is supplying and filtering out to all these other places, then those are likely going to fade out. Go ahead.
Just one quick note on this, too, is this particular case we have, since we tracked an actual physical asset of a property, that becomes really compelling to law enforcement as well, because you have the online tip, you have the player, and you have some property and some assets associated that would be fully worth doing an investigation, and that really helps prioritize with law enforcement as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit further. So when we're taking this network, you want to go to the next slide? And now we're going to take all that aggregate data, right, all those data points, the addresses, the phone numbers, the emails, website registrations, associates, all that stuff. We can even look at criminal records, you know, public records of criminal activity. And now we start to build a timeline. So from that particular network, you're just looking at a summary of the number of different street addresses and variations in which phone numbers, the counterfeit domains that they had with all the different registered names, all the email addresses, again, all back to that one particular target. So in this particular case, it was kind of interesting because we started then looking at the timeline of, how it relates to the counterfeit activity once we had that target in place. And what we were able to find was that the target had filed for bankruptcy at some point and, several years back, but then shortly afterwards had purchased a pretty significant beachfront property in Florida. And then when we looked at kind of the counterfeit activity, the domain name registrations, the buying and selling, we realized that there was a connection there, or potential connection, where that counterfeit activity could have potentially funded the purchase of that property. So again, now we're back to an asset, right? You've got a beachfront property in Florida and somebody's just declared bankruptcy not so long ago. So this is the kind of stuff that law enforcement has expressed, and I think brand owners to some point have expressed as well, is being really valuable information. Now you've got something that you can actually, seize and get a hold of that has some true value. Okay. Next. I think I'm on next one. All right. So we can't kind of talk about all of this stuff and all the great things that it does and where we can go with it without, at least touching on the barriers. And we know that there are some. I think, the biggest thing is that we realize there are barriers to anybody kind of doing this on their own. And that's why, we want to be able to help brand owners as much as possible. We understand that lack of time, lack of money, lack of resourcing, having boots on the ground in particular areas that can do this investigation for you, and just having all that data. I mean, you may have access to certain pieces and parts of it. Maybe you have one or two and you need the other 5 or 6 to tie it all together. So again, kind of going back to that initial point of having that one starting spot, that one tip, whether it's that marketplace seller or that counterfeit website, and then we can expand it from there, and we can help you pull all the other different data points together. So kind of use us as, the resource and the time that maybe you don't have to fill in some of those gaps.
One thing we can help with as well is maybe you're not an established, you don't have an established brand protection program. Our team of experts also does quite a bit of consulting work, too, to help plug you into these entities. So if you have an appetite to do these kinds of activities, we do have people who can connect you with these different agencies, help you set up a test buy program, help you go through the process, and at least explain to the stakeholders in the company why this is important to do, what the benefits are, and how you can start leveraging these things. We do have consultants that are more than happy to sit down and walk you through a lot of these points.
All right, so we at least have to talk about, what some of the benefits are. If we want to hit the barriers, we want to talk about the benefits as well, because that's really, where you're going to be able to go and take this and show some type of impact. By identifying, disabling those targets and potentially seizing assets, you will have an ROI that you can put an actual dollar amount to. Now, we're not going to claim that you're always going to have a house or a property that you can go after or big assets to seize, but certainly the likelihood of that with an investigation of this type is going to be greater than just, the typical process that we're used to on a day-to-day basis. There could also be potentially accounts that are tied to those counterfeit sites, if purchases are going through, or the marketplace accounts as well. So you will actually have a tangible ROI that you can take and know that, what the value of that has been. And then you'll also be able to redirect some of those whack-a-mole efforts to a more focused investigation and takedown approach that will likely have a larger impact. So again, as I mentioned, I think there is still value in making sure we keep the noise at a certain level, because if you don't attack even the individual sellers on a day-to-day basis of what's going on online, and you walk away from that, that will increase. But, really essentially what you want to do is get back to the source. So even if you can only do that once or twice a year, you're probably going to have a larger impact overall and really find a focused investigation, from that starting point. And then in changing that focus a bit, you can also, I think, save some of your dollars by going from those multiple repeated and sometimes random test purchases to a more focused and specific purchase where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So now if you're looking at purchasing just from a network or a target versus all the individual pieces, you can save some of that budget.
Yep. Another key benefit we've seen from our clients is fewer warranty center complaints. Because they've taken this offensive measure and addressed the most egregious infringement, they've got fewer and fewer complaints, and their distributors are as happy as can be. So it's something we can also measure just as far as effectiveness. Increased online traffic to brand site or affiliates. This is a big benefit when we're talking about a litigation strategy if you're seizing rogue sites. Once you seize those domain names, you can figure out where to put those, where to point those domain names. Maybe there's a distributor you want to point it to or your legitimate site and increase the traffic naturally that way. So someone who may be, a consumer who may be confused that it's a legitimate site won't be confused anymore. They'll point directly to your site and they'll find the right place. And then finally, just the ability to track progress and increase efficacy across the board. And since we do have a few more minutes, I do want to talk about one other thing. We've been talking a lot about the offensive strategies, right? Going after people. But to use the cheesy sports analogy, there's defense and offense, right? So going back to our defensive strategies, like Nancy was just saying, it's important to keep your thumb on the problem. So while C&D measures may feel like whack-a-mole efforts at times, it's very important to keep those going because you're addressing the infringement immediately on marketplaces, on websites, on social media. You're doing those consumer protection efforts and education, and you're keeping that infringement down on a daily basis. And that's so important. Search engine delisting, I know, is a very hot topic. If your site is not on the first page at the top result of Google, there's a problem going on, and you need to really keep a hold on that. So defense is a critical point of this effort. However, there is, to win the game, we'll be super cheesy here, you need to play offense and defense, right? It looks like all my guys are off to the side, so hopefully that's kind of a problem. They're not playing the game, but if they were, it'd be more of an offensive strategy. So this is what we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about civil suits, law enforcement, finding a target and going after that. But it's so important to have the two components together to really be effective. If you're just solely targeting somebody, you're missing all the activity that's going on outside. You may be missing some very egregious stuff that's going on and harming consumers. But if you're just playing defense, you're not truly affecting the problem. We've seen both cases here at MarkMonitor. We have a wide variety of clients. And the clients who do constantly play defense, they do suffer from that fatigue. There's kind of, okay, what are you going to do? What are we going to do next? We don't really know. Maybe it's good enough. Maybe that's what your company is focused on, and that's fine. We understand that. We're not trying to necessarily push you in this direction at all. There is definitely a balance in corporate priorities that need to be taken into consideration, and just the culture as well. But just know that those activities, while important, are not really going to get to the root of the problem. And same with offensive strategies. You're never going to really eradicate all the problems, right? But you can make a noticeable difference. And we have seen that through the benefits we just talked about with the fewer complaints. Consumers that are maybe not returning as many items. We do have one customer who is complaining quite a bit about people bringing back counterfeit items they purchased online into their stores. And they can't take it back. They don't want that. They don't want to have that on hand. It's a liability. And, it's becoming a big trend. So that's when they really started looking to the online source, let's take this down. And they were able to see, they actually started measuring the traffic that came in from their stores, from people buying, illegitimate products unknowingly, and they saw a measurable decrease over time. So that's another great measure to do. Whatever measures you have in place, we suggest always taking a temperature first and then doing these brand protection efforts simultaneously to affect the change there. So Nancy, do you have anything else to add on this one? Or?
I don't think